Walk into any grocery store, fill your cart with everything the labels call healthy, and you will still walk out missing the one thing nearly every human diet kept for thousands of years. Your great-grandparents had it in a crock by the stove, or a jar on the windowsill. You almost certainly don't have one right now. What you're missing is living food, not a supplement or a probiotic pill. Food that is still alive when you eat it, packed with the bacteria your body evolved alongside. For most of history, people didn't have refrigerators. They had salt, water, thyme, and a clay pot. So they fermented. Then we modernized, and most of what now calls itself fermented has been heated until nothing is alive. The taste survived, but the living part didn't. If your digestion isn't what it used to be, if meals sit heavier than in your 30s or 40s, you are not imagining it. The living foods that did this work for your grandparents got engineered out of the modern diet, and most people never replaced them. So today, we go back. 15 ancient fermented foods ordinary people ate every day. Most cost almost nothing and can be made at home. The last is a deep red drink that gets its moment at the end. Stick around. Number 15 is one you have heard of, sauerkraut. And yes, I can already hear you thinking, I've had that, it comes in a jar at the store, so what's ancient about that? Here is the thing. The sauerkraut sitting on a warm grocery shelf, the kind that doesn't need refrigeration, has almost always been pasteurized. It's been heated to kill everything off, so it can sit there for a year. What you are buying is sour cabbage with the life cooked out of it. It tastes the part, but does almost none of the work. Real sauerkraut is just cabbage, salt, and thyme. You shred the cabbage, you work in about 2% of its weight in salt, you press it down under its own juices so no air gets in, and you wait. The salt holds off spoilage for a few days, while the lactic acid bacteria that live naturally on the cabbage wake up and take over. They turn the sugars in the cabbage into lactic acid, which is what makes it tangy, what preserves it for months, and what makes it teem with the living cultures that traditionally support digestion. Every old European kitchen had a crock of this going. It was winter insurance and a daily tonic at the same time. To bring it back, you do one of two things. You make it, which costs you a head of cabbage and a tablespoon of salt, or you buy it from the refrigerated section, never the shelf, and you check the label for the words raw, live, or unpasteurized. A forkful alongside a meal is how people ate it. Not a bowl, a forkful. That is the one you knew. Number 14 is one your grandmother almost certainly made and almost nobody makes anymore. Number 14 is buttermilk. And again, hold on, because the buttermilk in the carton at the store isn't what this word used to mean. Original buttermilk was a liquid left behind after churning butter. It sat out, the wild bacteria in it soured it naturally, and you drank it tangy and slightly thick. It was the everyday refreshment of farm kitchens across Europe, the British Isles, and the American South. Nothing was wasted. The leftover liquid from making butter became a cultured drink full of living bacteria. What sits in the carton today is mostly milk with an acid added to it to mimic the tang for baking. It's useful for biscuits, but not for the original benefits. Cultured buttermilk made the traditional way is a fermented dairy drink in the same family as the ones coming up later on this list. The culturing breaks down much of the lactose, which is the milk sugar that gives a lot of people, especially past 50, trouble, and it delivers lactic acid bacteria that traditionally supported digestion. You can still make it at home, the same way people kept a batch going for generations. The first batch needs a starter, which is just a little live culture to get things going. You can use a few spoonfuls of store-bought buttermilk that lists live cultures on the label, or a powdered buttermilk culture from the store. You stir that into fresh, whole milk, leave it on the counter overnight, and by morning, it has thickened and soured into the real thing. Then you save a little from that batch to start the next one, and you never have to buy a starter again. I'm sure you recognise these first two. Now we go somewhere most people have never been. Number 13 is a fermented food you have likely never heard of, and once you have, you will wonder why it ever disappeared. Number 13 is Curtido. If that word is new to you, good, that's the point of this video. Curtido is a fermented cabbage relish from Central America, El Salvador in particular, where it sits on the table the way ketchup sits on ours. Picture sauerkraut, but with carrot, onion, oregano, and a little chili worked in, fermented the same lacto-fermented way with salt and thyme and nothing else. It's bright, crunchy, alive, and built to sit alongside heavy food and make it easier to get through. Entirely different cultures landed on the same idea independently. Europe got sauerkraut. Korea got kimchi, which is coming up. Central America got curtido. They didn't have the science. They had generations of noticing that fermented foods sat well and kept them well. You make curtido exactly like sauerkraut, with the vegetables shredded together and pressed under a salty brine for a few days. The traditional move is a spoonful on the side of a rich plate, where the living bacteria and the acidity traditionally support the digestion of the heavier food next to it. Number 12 takes us to a place most people only associate with one dish, and a fermented vegetable that turned a whole country into one of the longest lived on Earth. Number 12 is kimchi, the fermented vegetable that Korea built into the centre of nearly every meal. A lot of people think kimchi is just spicy cabbage, but it's much more than that. At its heart, it's Napa cabbage and radish, salted and fermented, then layered with garlic, ginger, chili, and scallion. There are hundreds of regional versions. Some families guard recipes the way others guard generational heirlooms. And in traditional Korean life, a household would ferment enormous batches in autumn to carry the family through winter, burying the pots in the ground to hold a steady, cool temperature. This was a community event known as Kimjang. What makes kimchi matter for this list is the same engine as sauerkraut and curtido, lactic acid bacteria doing the preserving, but with far more flavour and complexity. The result is a living food that traditionally supported digestion and was eaten in small amounts at almost every meal, not as a side dish you have once in a while on a night out. You can buy it refrigerated and raw, same rule as before, check that it has not been pasteurised. Or you can make it at home once you are comfortable with the simpler ferments. Now the list takes a turn. The next one isn't a vegetable, and it's the one I would point a 50+ cook toward first. Number 11 is tempeh. Everything so far has been a vegetable in a brine. Tempeh is something else. It's whole soybeans fermented into a firm, sliceable cake by a mould that knits the beans together. It comes from Indonesia, where it's been a staple protein for centuries. You can slice it, fry it, crumble it, and unlike most fermented foods, it holds up to cooking and actually tastes better for it. A lot of people past 50 are looking for protein that is easier on the body than a slab of red meat at every meal. Tempeh is a fermented, plant-based protein. The fermentation does something important. It breaks down some of the compounds in soybeans that otherwise make them hard to digest, which traditionally made the beans far gentler on the stomach than unfermented soy. Essentially, you get substantial protein in a form your body has an easier time with. The simplest start is to slice it thin, pan-fry it until golden, and use it where you would use chicken in a stir-fry or even a sandwich. It's one of the few items on this list that works as the centre of the plate instead of the side of it. The next three are the deep, savoury, old-world ferments. They look humble in the jar, but what they do is anything but. Number 10 is miso, the fermented soybean paste at the foundation of Japanese cooking. Miso is made by fermenting soybeans with salt and a cultured grain, usually rice or barley, sometimes for months, and in the old days, for years. The longer it ferments, the darker and deeper it gets. A pale miso is young and mild. A dark red miso has been working for a long time. This is a food measured in seasons. Japan eats miso most often as a morning soup, and I pay attention if I were you, because Japan is one of the longest lived populations on Earth, and these daily fermented foods are part of how they eat. Miso brings living cultures, along with a deep, savoury flavour that makes vegetables and broth taste like a full meal. One traditional point worth knowing, so you don't waste it. Miso is not meant to be boiled. Boiling water kills the living cultures. The old way, and the right way, is to stir a spoonful into warm water or warm broth that has come off the heat, so the flavour and the living part both survive. A spoonful in warm water in the morning is one of the simplest fermented habits you can build, and one of the oldest. Number 9 stays in the savoury world, but trades the paste for something with a deep red colour and a much older reputation as a tonic. Number 9 is fermented beets, and I mean the food here. The whole sliced beet eaten with a fork. Hold on to that, by the way, because a fermented drink is going to close out this whole list. Fermented beets are an Eastern European staple. You slice or cube raw beets, you submerge them in a salt brine, and you let the same lactic acid bacteria go to work for several days until they turn deeply tangy. The colour alone makes them worth it on a plate, a dual dark red that looks like nothing else in the refrigerator. Beets bring something the cabbage ferments don't. They are naturally rich in compounds your body uses to support healthy blood flow. And the fermentation makes the nutrients in them more available to you while adding the living cultures on top. In traditional Eastern European kitchens, fermented beets were both a winter vegetable and something closer to a daily tonic. A few slices with a meal or chopped into a salad is the ordinary way in. Now, after all that dark, still savouriness, the next one is alive in a way you can actually watch. It bubbles. Number 8 is honey-fermented garlic, and it's the one that earns a place in the medicine corner of the old kitchen. This one is almost too simple. You peel raw garlic cloves, you cover them completely in raw honey, and you let them sit. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happens. The garlic draws moisture out, the wild cultures in the raw honey wake up, and the whole jar begins to ferment. It bubbles. It goes from thick and still to active and loose, and the honey turns thin and golden and runs like syrup. The garlic mellows from harsh and sharp into something soft and almost sweet. Both halves of this recipe carried a traditional reputation. Garlic has been used as a folk remedy across nearly every culture that ever grew it to support the body through cold months. Raw honey was the original preservative and a traditional soother in its own right. Ferment them together and you get a pantry staple that old kitchens reached for at the first sign of a sniffle. A small spoonful of the honey, or one of the garlic cloves, was the traditional dose. A word of care, since this audience deserves the real information. Honey-fermented garlic must stay fully submerged and made correctly, because garlic in oil or honey can carry a botulism risk if it's done carelessly. Made properly, kept cool, kept covered, it is a centuries-old staple. Number 7 is the most divisive food on this entire list. People either love it or cannot get near it. Either way, it might be the single most powerful one here. Number 7 is natto, and I'm not going to pretend it's for everyone. Natto is fermented soybeans, Japanese, traditionally wrapped in rice straw and left to ferment for about a day. It comes out sticky, stringy, and strong smelling. There's definitely a reason it divides people, but there is also a good reason it's been eaten in Japan for over 1,000 years. Many believe it has a lot to do with how long Japanese people live. The specific bacteria that make natto, a strain of Bacillus subtilis, produce two things almost nothing else in the human diet delivers in this amount. The first is a form of vitamin K2 called MK7. Natto is the single richest food source of it on Earth by a wide margin, with more than 100 times the amount found in most cheeses. K2 is the nutrient that helps your body direct calcium where it belongs, into your bones, and traditionally supports keeping it out of places it doesn't belong. For an audience thinking about bone strength, that's information worth holding on to. The second is an enzyme called nattokinase. It's produced by the Bacillus subtilis during natto fermentation, and it has been studied for its association with circulation and healthy blood flow. And on top of both, natto has a long reputation as a food that supports the gut. The traditional serving is small, a few tablespoons, often over rice with a little soy sauce and mustard in the morning. You don't need much, except an open mind. Now we are on to something gentle and familiar. Number 6 is a food you've eaten 100 times without ever realizing it belonged on a list like this. Number 6 is cheese. I'm talking about the real, traditionally made, aged kind. This usually surprises people because nobody thinks of cheese as a fermented food, but it's one of the oldest out there. Remember, cheese begins as milk and a culture. Bacteria ferment the milk sugars, the curds separate, and then the long, slow aging begins. A traditionally made aged cheese that has been ripened for months in a cave or a cellar is the product of fermentation from start to finish. The aging is basically the fermentation continuing to work. That's where the deep flavour of a good aged cheese comes from. Two things to note here. First, the long aging process breaks down most of the lactose, the milk sugar, which is why many people who can't drink a glass of milk can eat a well-aged cheese with no trouble at all. The fermentation did the work their gut struggles to do. Second, raw milk cheeses aged the old way carry living cultures, which is the part that connects them to everything else here. The modern version, the individually wrapped processed slice, is to real cheese what shelf sauerkraut is to the living jar. Skip it. Find a good aged cheese and enjoy a small piece, the way people have for centuries. Number 5 brings us back to an ancient drink, and it is the richest source of living cultures on this list. Number 5 is Kefir. If sauerkraut is the gateway fermented vegetable, then Kefir is the gateway fermented drink. It comes from the Caucasus Mountains, the rugged region between the Black Sea and the Caspian, where it's been made for thousands of years. The story passed down is that the fermenting cultures were treated as family wealth, handed from one generation to the next, because you can't easily make kefir without them. Those cultures are the key. Kefir is made with kefir grains, which are not grains at all, but small, soft, cauliflower-looking clusters of bacteria and yeast living together. You drop them into milk, leave it at room temperature for about a day, strain the grains back out, and you're left with a tangy, slightly fizzy drink. The same grains go into the next batch. People have kept the same culture going for decades. A lot of people confuse kefir with yogurt, but here's what sets it apart. Yogurt is made with a handful of bacterial strains, whereas kefir grains contain dozens, sometimes more than 30 different bacteria and yeasts working together. That makes it one of the most diverse living foods you can put in your body. The fermentation also consumes much of the milk sugar, so like aged cheese, kefir is often well tolerated by people who struggle with plain milk. As you'd imagine, it has a long traditional reputation for supporting digestion and the gut. All you need is a small glass. And try to skip the sweetened flavoured versions that undo half the point. You can buy it plain and refrigerated, or once you have the grains, you can make it forever for the cost of the milk. The next two are the same food, 8,000 miles and a few thousand years apart. Bread. It was fermented long before it came in a bag, and we start where it began. Number 4 is Injera, and through it, the forgotten truth about bread itself. Injera is the national bread of Ethiopia and Eritrea, a large, soft, spongy flatbread with a slightly sour taste. It's made from a tiny ancient grain called teff, mixed with water into a batter, and then left to ferment for a few days before it is cooked. That fermentation process is the whole method. It's what gives Injera its sour tang, its airy texture, and its long traditional reputation as a bread that sits well. For the cultures that eat it, Injera isn't served as a side, it's the plate, the utensil, and the meal all at once. Stews and vegetables are served directly on top of it, and you tear off pieces to scoop everything up. Whole nations have eaten fermented bread every day for as far back as their history records. Long before bread became the soft, fast-made, shelf-stable loaf in the plastic bag, bread was fermented. People let the grains sit and sour and come alive before they ever baked it. The fermentation traditionally made the grain easier to digest. We didn't invent that, we just forgot it. The same idea has been hiding in a traditional European loaf the whole time, and most people walk past it in the bakery without knowing what it really is. Number 3 is true sourdough, and it's the same ancient idea as Injera brought home to the Western kitchen. Real sourdough isn't a flavour you add, it's a process. You make a starter, which is just flour and water left out until the yeast, the bacteria in the air, and the grain all start to bubble. You feed it, it stays alive, and people pass starters down or share them the way they once shared kefir grains. Some bakeries are still using starters that are decades old. That long, slow fermentation is what makes real sourdough different from the soft loaf in the bag. As the starter works, it begins to break down the starches and the gluten in the flour, traditionally making the finished bread gentler on the stomach than fast-risen modern bread. This is the bread a lot of people describe as the one that doesn't bother them the way ordinary bread does. The old method did something the modern shortcut skips. The way back to true sourdough is either to bake it yourself, which has become a craft many people have happily taken up, or to buy genuine slow-fermented sourdough from a real bakery. Sourdough from a real bakery cannot compete with that supermarket loaf that has sourdough printed on the label, but was actually made fast with added flavouring. Check that the ingredients are flour, water, and salt only. Number 2 takes the oldest preservative humans ever found and turns it into something between a food and a treasure. And this is nothing like the garlic from earlier. This one is sweet. Number 2 is wild-fermented fruit, the sweet cousin of the garlic from earlier, and one of the oldest preservation methods on Earth. Long before refrigeration, before canning, before sugar was cheap, people had one reliable way to carry fruit through the seasons. They preserved it in honey, or they let it ferment in its own sugars. Honey is a preservative all on its own, one of the few foods that essentially never spoils. Pack fresh fruit into raw honey, and the wild cultures in the honey and on the fruit begin a slow, gentle fermentation. The fruit softens, the honey thins and takes on the flavour of the fruit, and you end up with a living preserve that keeps for a very long time. This is the sweet end of the same craft we've been talking about all the way through. The garlic became a savoury remedy for the medicine corner. Fermented fruit was the opposite end, the pantry's sweetness and its preserved harvest in one jar. People enjoyed a spoonful over plain yogurt or kefir, stirred into warm water, or simply on its own. Our ancestors didn't separate food from medicine from preservation. A jar of fermented fruit was all three. It fed them, it kept them through the winter, and it carried the living cultures their bodies relied on. Which brings us to number 1, the oldest and the simplest on the list, and the one I saved for last on purpose. It is also the reason there is a whole second video coming. Number 1 is beet kvass. Most of this list has been food, and this one closes it out as a drink. A deep, dual red fermented tonic that was sipped across Russia, Ukraine and the Balkans for centuries, back when this was an everyday beverage and soda hadn't entered the scene. Here is how old and simple it is. You take raw beets, cut them into chunks, put them in a jar, cover them with water and a small amount of non-iodized salt, put a loose cover on top and set it on the counter. Over the next several days to a couple of weeks, the bacteria living on the beets wake up and ferment the sugars in the water. You'll even see it turn. The water pulls a deep red out of the beets. Small bubbles begin to rise, and the taste shifts from plain and sweet to tangy and earthy. When it's bubbling and tangy, you strain out the beets and keep the deep red liquid in the refrigerator. That liquid is beet kvass. In a way, beet kvass pulls this whole list together in a single glass. It carries the same living cultures as every ferment we've talked about, plus the natural compounds in beets that traditionally support healthy blood flow. In the old Eastern European households, a small glass before a meal was the traditional way to support digestion. It was as ordinary as a cup of coffee is for us. And beet kvass is just the beginning. Some of the oldest fermented traditions in the world are drinks. Things like water kefir, traditional tonics, and other sipping ferments from every corner of the world that people drank daily and have almost been forgotten over time. Most of them are even easier to make than the foods on this list, with the same ancient benefits behind them. That's our next video. The link to it is coming up on your screen shortly. So there it is, 15 ancient fermented foods that ordinary people ate every day that modern living pushed off the table. Start with one this week. Let your body get used to it and add the next when you're ready. That is exactly how your great-grandparents lived with these foods, one at a time, every day, without thinking twice. If you want a simple place to start, we put together a free guide. It takes the guesswork out. No filler, just the everyday swaps that bring the old ways back into your kitchen, so you can start making changes and start feeling better. The link is in the description, and it is free. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next one, here at the Natural Living Library.